in 2010, I think, when I was a grad student at Santa Barbara and you were coming to visit and check out our program. And it's been really wonderful to see all of the things that Ross has done since then, without needing a degree from Santa Barbara. Ross joins us from New York City. He serves as the co-director of the Endangered Language Alliance, a nonprofit, where he oversees research projects focused on language documentation, mapping, policy, and public programming. In addition to his leadership in language preservation and conservation, Dr. Perlin is a linguist, translator, and writer. He often teaches linguistics at Columbia University and translates primarily from Chinese to English. His latest book, Language City, The Fight to Preserve Endangered Mother Tongues in New York, has won the British Academy Book Prize and is longlisted for the Carnegie Medal. Today, he'll share case studies from Language City, exploring how speakers of 6 endangered languages in New York are working against overwhelming odds to maintain and revitalize their mother tongues. If you're interested, his book is also available for purchase at the UBC bookstore. Without further ado, join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Ross Perlin.
Thanks so much, Daisy. Thanks everyone for coming, for taking some time out of your day, your lunch break to talk with me. And I hope we can have this as a conversation, really informal, and talk about what you guys are interested in as well. Thank you so much to Language Sciences for having me, to Mona and to Dia and Adriana and others for organizing, to Daisy for the introduction, and also to Mark Turin, who's sadly far away, but is a longtime friend and colleague who helped make this possible. And to all of you for coming. I'm really excited to learn from you as well about the extraordinary language work which is going on here on Musqueam land and at UBC and in Canada more broadly. I want to talk about languages and cities, urban linguistic diversity, language endangerment and revitalization in cities, which I think matter more than ever for our linguistic futures. In my country, for instance, a situation that's increasingly dire at the national level, but cities, I think, have an alternative model to offer in some ways, as well as the kind of linguistic work which can be done in an independent community organization like the Endangered Language Alliance, which I'll talk a little about. We've been around since 2010, and as things become increasingly dire at academic institutions in my country, it's, I think, important to have independent research institutions as well. Early 21st century New York City, contemporary New York, is home to over 700 languages. That's something like 10% of the world's total. That may be the most that have ever been present in any single place, past or present, as far as we know. But that may also just be because New York is one of the few places for which urban linguistic diversity has been documented now in a sustained way, partly thanks to the last 15 years of work at the Endangered Language Alliance. So we believe that urban linguistic diversity goes much deeper than people usually realize. Most work on documenting languages and thinking about language endangerment usually kind of concerns people going to distant mountains and islands, often from kind of academic centers, and doing that kind of traditional field work. But I think increasingly we're in a time when linguists, community members, language activists can work as neighbors, making common cause, often kind of right next door in sustained long-term partnerships. So there's a sort of paradox at the heart of this work, which is that even as language endangerment is increasing everywhere, and I feel like this audience, you may already kind of, the background that I would usually give on kind of global linguistic diversity and language endangerment worldwide maybe is already really familiar to all of you, but linguists are estimating that as many as half of the world's 7,000 plus languages today are considered endangered. It's a pervasive phenomenon. It has a range of causes having to do with the policies of nation states, nationalism, colonialism, imperialism, capitalism. There's all kinds of things we could discuss about what is making languages endangered. And urbanization and migration are often seen as contributing factors, even if they are kind of epiphenomenal on those other ones. Usually cities have been seen as sites of language loss, and urbanization and migration as factors that induce language shift because of all of the economic, political, and social pressures that attend. But I think there are possibilities for documenting, maintaining, and even revitalizing languages in cities. And the paradox is that cities are more linguistically diverse than they have ever been, although that diversity has remained invisible and inaudible, certainly to policymakers and in general to most people who are not members of the communities themselves. So there is a new set of opportunities which I think people are just beginning to explore. And this is why the Endangered Language Alliance was founded in 2010 to support linguistic diversity and document endangered languages in New York and beyond as a kind of extended family or network of linguists, language activists, and others. So the sort of fuller story is in Language City, the book that Daisy mentioned. And that's kind of the deeper background to this whole talk. But I want to start by pointing out that another paradox within the urban linguistic diversity landscape in New York and nearly everywhere, just as much here, of course, is that in, around, above, within every contemporary city is the original language of the land it was built on. In the case of New York, Lenape, an Algonquian language, which today is highly endangered and often considered really to have one elderly speaker, a native speaker who's in her 80s, actually in Moraviantown, Ontario, given the successive displacements away from what became New York, Lenapehoking, the land of Lenape. But this is our center in the middle of Manhattan, and Karen, with the glasses, is who passed away and is profiled in the book. The glasses on top of her head. Was a teacher of Lenape, a second language learner, coming down from one of the Lenape reserves in Ontario, who would drive 10 hours every month and just completely kind of on her own dime, out of her own sheer force of will, to bring the language back for the first time, as far as we know, as a language being taught to Manhattan. Mannahatta, which is also a Lenape word, the place where we get bows, the wood for making bows, in a particular stand of trees, it's thought, that was at the southern tip of Manhattan. And Karen would always greet us with Kwengenawalomwa, which is so good to see all of you, with this kind of classic first person acting on second person prefix that you see in Algonquian languages. So a pretty unique feature of this language family. It appears in a few other language groups, but where you actually have, both the sort of two actors encoded in a single prefix in this way. And this is just kind of to give a sense of the series of displacements that took people from the Lenape archipelago, that is New York with its dozens of islands, that is today New York, to a series of diaspora places, including, as you can see there, in 1783, that part of Southwest Ontario, as well as reservations today in Oklahoma and Wisconsin, where it's miraculous that the language is continuing to be taught and revived increasingly by people such as Karen. It was on the Lenape archipelago that the Dutch founded, actually, the Dutch West India Company, a kind of unique entrepot, not a colony in perhaps the same sense as the other 12 colonies that later became the United States, which were primarily English-speaking. This was, as the very first Catholic priest to visit just a few decades in, found a truly kind of mixed world of peoples, speakers of 18 different languages, according to this estimate, among the first 400 to 500 inhabitants. Unfortunately, the languages are not sort of listed here, but I've tried to reconstruct them. And it seems that what was happening in this kind of new early 17th century port was the coming together of languages from 3 different continents. So you had the Native American languages, which were a very important presence, especially in those initial years for anything to happen, including not just different varieties of Lenape. It was really a kind of dialect continuum with that we can only kind of try to reconstruct, as well as visiting languages from nearby, in fact, completely different language families, such as Mohawk. The languages brought by enslaved Africans who were present from the very earliest years of this new kind of Dutch company town, including languages such as Kikongo and Kimbundu from what's now Angola and Congo. What the circumstances were like for actually using or transmitting these languages under the atmosphere of and the conditions of slavery is hard to know, but there are traces, small traces of evidence about actual language use and possible language transmission. And then languages from a range of groups across Europe, including many of what are now would be considered minority or endangered languages of Europe. So the very first settlers were religious refugees who spoke Walloon, and they were coming, kind of fleeing religious persecution, the Protestant Catholic Wars, and then they were recruited essentially by the company to be kind of the first permanent settlers. So this sets the template of what I would argue is a kind of a uniquely multilingual history in the city, although one that, as with everything I kind of talk about today, I think applies to many other cities as well. And we can find the kind of multilingual strands and apply the lens of language to the history of cities, I think in ways that haven't been done. In my book, Language City, I try to do a few different things. One is to tell the linguistic history of a city through especially its least known languages. So not just the kind of top level few languages, but try to see what it means to actually combine kind of urban history with linguistics in a certain way. At the same time, it's also the story of the particular work that is happening now at the Endangered Language Alliance and with others to try to document and maintain languages today. And then it's the portraits of these 6 speakers, whom I'll say a little bit more, but including Karen, who passed away actually just before the book was published. So the history, this is maybe a little tricky but to make out, but this is a sort of snapshot of Lower Manhattan, the original kind of urban core. The English take over from the Dutch after about 4 decades, rename New Amsterdam, New York, and try in some ways to impose English and bring English in, but have only kind of mixed success. And the history of the city is marked continually by immigration. There are waves and there are sort of ups and downs and different policies, but I would argue that fundamentally the history of the city, the way it patterns spatially, the way people settled, its economic, social, and political arrangements were deeply tied up with immigration. This is kind of a lot to look at, but it's kind of a capsule history of some of the main kind of themes I think that come out from a linguistic lens on the city's history. There's always been universal language shift. There's always been pressure to shift, often after the kind of classic 2 or 3 generations that happens in so many situations of immigration and urbanization, but at different rates. And we can learn a lot from seeing how different communities have dealt with language shift across the history of the city. Always it has been, I would argue, speakers of minority languages who have actually predominated in the waves of different people to the city. So even as applying a sort of anachronistic national lens, people will say, oh, Spanish New York formed around this time, or then there were French New Yorkers came at this time. Actually, the Spanish New Yorkers were Galician speakers, and the French New Yorkers were Breton speakers. And to talk about the sort of birth of Chinatown, for instance, one has to understand Toisanese as the kind of key early, as it was elsewhere in North America, the key early Sinitic language that came. So in almost every case, understanding the actual fluid dynamics of immigration and the actual hometowns and the actual routes that people are taking, and that through the lens of language and the mother tongues that people were bringing and the multilingualism that people were bringing, we actually can get a different sense of the history of the city and understand the real specific dynamics at work that a national lens, even today is kind of is insufficient. Of course, Ellis Island as this kind of the largest of all kind of gateways between the two hemispheres in the mass migrations of the 19th century, is kind of a fundamental piece of the city's history. Something like a third of all Americans trace their background to somebody coming through Ellis Island. But almost exactly 100 years ago, in 1924, a major anti-immigration movement that had been building in the US for several decades with all kinds of racist pseudoscience baked into it, succeeded in essentially slamming the door shut at Ellis Island and kind of more broadly in the country, freezing the ethnic and racial balance of the country. And it was not for another 4 decades or so, with this signal law in 1965, that the US reopened its doors. And that's really the world that we live in some sense, certainly in the US, in the world that 1965 made. This enabled migration from all over the globe, just at the time when aviation was becoming more common and different kinds of mobility were opening up. Although, again, we've always known that cities are diverse, and we could talk about the myth of Babel in the Bible and other ideas of urban linguistic diversity, often kind of negatively seen. But the depth of linguistic diversity that has happened in cities like New York, but not only New York, again, has just increased in the last several decades by a tremendous degree, to the point where about half of all New Yorkers speak a language other than English at home. Not only are there the sort of 700 plus languages I mentioned, and we'll talk more about, but there are about 10 languages with over 100,000 speakers, with Spanish in all of its forms as very much the sort of second language of the city, but then also languages such as Bengali and Arabic and Yiddish and Haitian Creole that have over 100,000 speakers, and now to some degree a level of government guarantee around language access and provision, however, sort of poorly implemented at times. And then, there are patterns to the city's linguistic diversity as well. And it's often not what people think in terms of kind of mono-ethnic or monolingual enclaves kind of all next to each other, but actually much more sort of interpenetrated single buildings where there are maybe dozens of languages, as well as vertical villages, one of which I describe in the book, where you can actually see a kind of village reconstituted in a sense in a single apartment building. The majority of the city's languages, just like the majority of the world's languages, are primarily oral, are indigenous minority languages without support, without a place on the internet which only really holds or represents significantly 5 to 10% of the world's linguistic diversity at most. So it raises the question of, well, what would a linguistic infrastructure look like for a city like New York or Toronto or Vancouver, among others? So one way we've tried to approach this as a piece of our work is through language mapping and bringing visibility to language communities that, for the most part, want it and are looking for interpretation, access to services, and just sort of a degree of pride and presence in cities. This is maybe tricky to see, but this is our kind of an initial print map that we created, which went through several versions, but it sort of color codes different regions of the world that languages are from. It builds on kind of years of discussions with language activists and speakers about the significant sites where a given language is used. So there are all kinds of challenges around language mapping, which we could talk about. This was a focus of work with Mark Turin and our colleague Sienna Craig at Dartmouth, with a Peter Wall Institute support to kind of think about language mapping in a new way. There's been a degree of language mapping that just kind of maps polygons of language onto territories, but doesn't really think about the way that language moves in the mouths of its speakers, the way that it's inherently fluid, and how you would map language in an urban context as well. So that was something we've been continuing to think through. There are no kind of easy answers. There are a lot of different choices to make, but we realized we had to do kind of our own linguistic census that And I'm curious about kind of Canadian census data, since there are a lot more questions, at least I've seen, about language on the census. And language, I think, is much more salient in public policy here, although perhaps often focused on the Anglophone-Francophone divide, and to a much lesser extent, perhaps the First Nations languages. But in the US, there is, I think, as in most countries, very little and very poor data about language, sort of from anywhere. So most of the languages that we have mapped and that we work with at the Endangered Language Alliance are nowhere to be seen in any official data set. They're not captured at all by the census. There are all kinds of reasons why that is: the way that the question is asked, the way that the census is administered, the way the data is tabulated. Multilingualism is not captured at all. Sign languages are not captured at all. And in general, the purpose is very narrow, and there's very little kind of public policy thought to linguistic diversity or value seen in it. And so the sort of 700 plus languages that we and counting that we've mapped represent something like 5 times the number that the census had previously recorded. And that's particularly kind of indigenous and minority languages that were just not captured on the census, including ones with thousands of speakers. So doing our own linguistic census, and then all the sort of technical challenges and sort of choices around mapping, and then seeing that, just to sort of zoom in on one area in southern Brooklyn that is kind of known as the Russian neighborhood, but really is a microcosm of the linguistic diversity of the former Soviet Union, which is to say that there are patterns and structures in the city's linguistic geography. And I think this is the case in most cities as well. It's of course, there are innumerable factors around housing and the cost of living and work and public transit and so on, but also that language and cultural factors also play a significant role in why people settle where they do, and the role in this case of a lingua franca like Russian, that actually then, through a sort of succession of immigration waves, kind of creates this kind of remarkable microcosm of the whole linguistic diversity, or much of the linguistic diversity of a whole region, then shrunk down to the size of a city neighborhood. So languages that would previously have been, in many cases, hundreds or thousands of miles separated from each other, and perhaps there's nowhere actually in the former Soviet Union today where so many of its languages would be so close together. So Russian may function as a lingua franca, but actually you increasingly have speakers of the languages of Central Asia, the Caucasus, and Siberia, among others. And of course, it's not just this, and it's much more complicated than this. This is still a kind of representation based on those significant sites. So it could be mosques, churches, restaurants, community centers, and deliberately, of course, showing the less common languages kind of more prominently. We could, of course, English, Russian, and Spanish are also very much here, but they're sort of restricted and backgrounded a little bit so that the deeper diversity can be seen. We see this also in the kind of West African microcosms of Harlem and the Bronx, where over 100 different West African languages today are spoken. And again, there'll be a lingua franca, whether it be French among Francophone West Africans, or English or Arabic in certain cases. In the indigenous South Bronx as well, people from across Mexico and Guatemala, where Spanish may be a lingua franca, but actually there are significant communities of people speaking Mixteco, Tlapaneco, Zapoteco, and other indigenous languages. Another example that I'll kind of zoom in on a little bit more, the Himalayan or even wider South Asian world around Jackson Heights, Queens. Queens is probably the most linguistically diverse part of the most linguistically diverse city, New York, and that I think is something you also see in cities more generally, is that the sort of older areas that are becoming wealthier and more gentrified that one thinks of when one thinks of the city. Those are, of course, not necessarily places that people can afford to settle today, but that it's actually increasingly in outlying areas and even in suburban areas where more and more of the diversity is. So here, Nepali and to an extent Hindi and Tibetan may be lingua francas, but you actually have speakers from across the Himalaya who are now suddenly in these new situations of language contact with each other. You have new types of language mixing, which are also fascinating and important to study. But you have even languages that have just a few hundred speakers that now have some representation here in the middle of this new kind of microcosm. And maybe just briefly to give a sense of, well, what does this look like on the ground? A map is all well and good, and if we could sort of walk together through the city, that would be the best. But it's often kind of low-slung blocks like this. It's not the skyscrapers or Wall Street or Broadway or the sort of marquee things that you might think. It's a kind of unassuming block where you have a Dominican hair salon, an Egyptian-owned cell phone store, a check cashing place where a lot of Mixteco speakers, cash their checks, a West African hair braiding place, a Fujianese-owned laundromat, a Yemeni bodega. It's events like this where I was a couple of weeks ago, a Pontic Greek 60th anniversary annual dinner, and the youth group dancing. The Pontic Greeks are from what's now Turkey and speak an endangered variety of Greek that's quite distinct. It's the Queen's Public Library providing actual support in several dozen languages here, and it's the Pashkvilim, as they're called in Yiddish, which are these kind of religious and community announcements, which are posted kind of all over neighborhoods like Williamsburg, where Yiddish is enjoying a kind of remarkable revival and being passed on in the fourth and fifth generation there. That's part of the sort of public landscape of signage. It's a Polish bakery being repurposed as a Roma club, where speakers of varieties of Roma or Romani are kind of being welcomed pretty publicly, which is pretty unusual given the history of persecution that has led many to kind of hide a little bit. It's a building like this in the middle of that Himalayan microcosm in Jackson Heights, where you have a whole bunch of organizations, each renting rooms, and you have hometown associations, which are the bedrock of the immigrant city, called Kiduk in Tibetan or Samaj in South Asian languages, that represent, where people have come from and are kind of enduring forms of connection, transnational or translocal connection between, a particular place that people have immigrated to and a particular place in the home country as well. So here, the Gyalsumdo Sewasanta, that's a particular valley in Nepal where an endangered language is spoken by just a few hundred people, but they have an organization in New York where people still can kind of continue to speak the language. A paqueteria for those who've come from particular parts of Mexico to be able to send packages back in a trusted way to their family members back home. And you can see by sort of the names of particular hometowns, especially in the southern states of Puebla and Guerrero, where something like 3/4 of all Mexican New Yorkers are from, which are heavily indigenous areas, which is why the rate of use of indigenous languages or knowledge of indigenous languages in New York is 3 times what it is in Mexico, because of the particular place people are coming from. 2 speakers of Southern Zaza, which is a Kurdish language from Turkey, who are just chatting in the park. A washroom that has an ad for a Senegalese election back home with some language in Wolof and French telling the diaspora who they should vote for. A Quechua-speaking street procession, a mural in a restaurant sort of showing connections between New York and Kathmandu, a Newari-owned restaurant, people of the Kathmandu Valley. A salon in Harlem where my friend Keule Kamara, Karanko Bard or Fina from Sierra Leone, gives a kind of performance amidst other different kind of artists from across the African diaspora. So what I mentioned about Mexico, this is a kind of linguistic map of Mexico. It's the fact that people are coming from that area where you can see kind of in southern Mexico, there are, that particular density of different colors and different indigenous languages. The fact that people are coming from there, that particular migration route and story is what then makes a place like New York into a kind of new center of indigenous languages. Likewise, with the Mayan languages of Guatemala, the fact that people are coming from the Western Highlands, where many Mayan languages are spoken, means that these are kind of linguistic hotspots on the move. when people migrate. An example of a kind of triple or even quadruple diaspora is Garifuna, and there are probably more speakers of Garifuna in New York than perhaps anywhere else. This is a language that was brought by enslaved Africans who escaped onto the island of St. Vincent initially, intermarried with local Arawakan speakers. This is an indigenous Caribbean language, and then were exiled by the British to the coast of Central America, so Honduras and Belize, and then have sort of further migrated from there with this kind of extraordinary mixed language, which has still managed to survive in the context of a wider multilingualism. And then the increasingly large migration from the Andes of speakers of all varieties of Quechuan languages, especially Quechua forms from Ecuador, who've come to New York increasingly just in the last couple of years. This is sort of breakdown of then particular sort of neighborhoods where people move to. And of course, within sort of complex patterns of pan-ethnic identification and different sort of settlement patterns. But all in all, it means that there are sort of these extraordinary opportunities both to sort of work with communities and then also to understand how different communities are coming into contact. Likewise, Nepal, which we mentioned briefly, a country of an estimated 140 or so languages, where, again, kind of focusing on that Himalayan microcosm in Queens, almost all of those from the Himalayan layer of Nepal are now kind of coming into this wider Himalayan or Tibetan diaspora. And even just to zoom in on one particular valley called Mustang, which is on the Nepal-Tibet border, culturally and religiously, traditionally Tibetan, now kind of swallowed up within the Nepali nation state. You have among about 10,000 people, really half a dozen languages, basically, of which all are now represented in diaspora very strongly and have communities in New York. And just to show kind of something about settlement patterns, there's even a kind of mapping of how people live within Mustang onto how people move to New York. And you can see those from the sort of northern part, speaking language usually called Loke, have kind of settled in the northern part of New York at a higher elevation. The elevations are much higher on the Himalayan side, but there is a sort of interesting parallel. And those from the southern part settling kind of in a lower elevation or southern part of New York. And then this community who speak a language called Seke, which we've worked on in particular, from just 5 villages, still kind of, even in New York, also embedded within the same kind of other Mustangi community when people come to Brooklyn. And just as an example of what kinds of things migration is doing linguistically, we're talking about a language with really at most 700 speakers, a Tamangic language, so part of the Tibeto-Burman or Trans-Himalayan linguistic world, but closer to Tamang and Gurung and some other languages of kind of central Nepal. People highly multilingual, but now probably this is a low estimate, maybe as many as a quarter, as many as a third of all speakers have come to New York, and the villages are empty. You hear this often in the sending regions that people are coming from. The villages are empty. There's only older people. Maybe some young children are left. Everybody of working age is moving to cities. It's not just New York, a city on the other side of the world, but it's also some of the intermediate cities like Kathmandu and Pokhara, which are the 2 kind of important Nepali cities. But this is where speakers are, and this is the sort of the contrast between the village and the vertical village. And in the vertical village, there is a sort of repurposing of space. This is where younger speakers are. This is from just one community gathering. In there is Rasmina, who has been my kind of one of my closest colleagues on this, one of the youngest speakers in her 20s. Most of the other people in the picture have already kind of shifted primarily to Nepali, but she was raised by her grandmother in the village to a certain degree so that the language is kind of more with her. You can have a picnic on July 4th, which just happens to be the day that people have off from long hours of work in grocery stores, driving Ubers, working as nail technicians, to have over 100 people gathering, a significant portion of the language community gathering at a single picnic. So There's a lot more we could say about vertical villages. I try to sort of describe this form through the example of Seke. Of course, not every community will have this. Of course, it's um, can be very fragile in some senses because it's at dependent on landlords and other economic and other factors. But there is a role that they can play in language maintenance, and there is a kind of extraordinary space that people are carving out and reconstituting even in the middle of the city. And this is just a kind of to emphasize that for speakers of a language like Seke, there's also an extraordinary multilingualism that is just part of the picture, where English is certainly coming in increasingly. Tibetan is important for religious and wider community purposes. Nepali is the national language. And then there are these other languages that I showed that they're sort of surrounded by in both Mustang and New York. And so it's common for people to be speaking 5 or 6 languages and to need to use these in different spheres of life, and that this continues over into places like New York. And in terms of linguistic fieldwork, what this means, I think, is also that we need to sort of think about what this kind of multi-sided, both diaspora and homeland fieldwork looks like, and understand that the future and the fate of languages depends on sort of all the places where they're spoken now. Every group is in diaspora today, I would argue. Diasporization has become a universal phenomenon. And many different groups, I think, are adjusting and how they're thinking about it. Of course, there are huge differences in terms of how accessible the homeland is, whether people can go there, whether research can be done there. There are different conceptions of homeland. There are, of course, things that can only be documented and understood, perhaps, in a homeland. But then there are also opportunities in the diaspora spaces. And some of those opportunities have to do with the nature of a kind of new linguistic fieldwork that can be done by linguists and communities working together, and the types of resources which are in cities and at universities, media, academic resources, technology, different platforms that are part of why people come to cities to begin with. And then, of course, in cities, you're also fundamentally dealing with language shift and language mixing and contact, and those factors are also fascinating and important to understand. So we've been finding this way of trying to work between places, this is an image of the digital version of the map that I just showed that has been developed subsequently, where languages like Seke are not only now kind of visible and marked, but actually you can access the recordings that we've done in over 100 different languages through our 15 years of work. You can sort and in various ways filter and work with the data. You can compare the census data and see that it may be useful for the largest languages, but then quickly drops off. But you can kind of make comparisons that allow you to unpack what the census is missing or is saying. And in various ways, kind of get the stories of different languages by clicking on any given dot, which represents one of these significant sites. A sort of story comes up that tells you about the community that is coming from the community, and that is really the sort of the heart of it. So a little bit about the Endangered Language Alliance that has kind of been the site for this work and a kind of platform and center for it. It's this all-purpose space where all these different activities happen, some of which are kind of traditional language documentation, where you're working on a dictionary and a grammar and recording and analyzing texts. And we've done some of that with languages like Seke, where there is almost no work previously. But also public events and bringing languages to the stage, poets, performances, storytellers, musicians, which have not been presented before, perhaps anywhere for a wider audience. An indigenous radio station led for years by our friend Leobardo, a Quiche speaker from Guatemala, karaoke even as a way of teaching and transmitting language in the case of Garifuna by James, speaker-led documentation, performance, classes in languages that are not really being taught anywhere else and that are kind of community language classes where we provide a space and where desired kind of pedagogical help. Publishing and literacy. Children's books are high on the agenda for speakers of many languages. And in general, our mode and most of our projects come from people who come to us and say, I want to do X or Y with my language. And we try to see if there's some way we can help, whether it's in terms of space, technology, or linguistic knowledge or something else. But children's books are an important one, and kind of questions of literacy, because even if most languages have traditionally been fine being completely oral, there's often, as part of maintenance and revitalization in the city, a need to or desire to have written materials. Collaborations with artists. This is also just to kind of feature and give a sense of some of the people who are behind these projects. So James, I mentioned the Garifuna musician and activist. Irwin, who's featured in the book, a poet and chef, speaker of Nahuatl from Mexico, who also sort of cooks with his etymologies and knowledge of Nahuatl, which is the language that sort of underlies so much of Mexican cuisine as we know it today. Here is Nazir, a speaker of Wakhi from Pakistan, Majda from Kabardian speaker, and two others, Narayan in the center from a speaker of Gurung from Nepal, Zanaida, who I mentioned, and just different sorts of, things that people are interested in doing. This is a game of chance, kind of like bingo, called Loteria, that's popular in Mexico, but it's being used here to teach Mixteco, that the major indigenous language of Mexico that's in New York. Increasingly, our work has turned also to advocacy and language access, and the map in particular has kind of connected us to and brought us to the attention of different city agencies who are looking to understand the linguistic diversity that they know is in New York, but they haven't sort of been able to contact communities or know what to do. So that took on a kind of added importance during the height of COVID, when multilingual immigrant communities were the most affected, at the epicenter of the epicenter in March, April 2020, when New York was the hardest hit. And a lot of that had to do with, it was a language crisis as well. It was about material not being translated well or in a timely fashion or being made available. And so we ended up doing a whole project with the Department of Health. I mean, there's a lot more focus on having interpreter co-ops and basically kind of having the access to information that comes with proper language resources. So this is a kind of just diagram, complex that is, of what I think an urban language organization such as the ELA can do, kind of standing in between different audiences and connecting communities to a range of possible platforms. So maybe just to finish up and then get into questions and discussions. I think in terms of the future, the fear is that this is peak diversity today, and that the challenges and threats are mounting from different directions. And that includes universal language shift, which is happening in the homelands as well. So you can no longer count on immigration and speakers coming from the homelands to kind of replenish languages as people shift in cities. The sort of double-sided coin of the internet. We certainly use technologies in various ways for this work, but at the same time, as I said, very few of the world's languages are meaningfully in the digital realm, and there are huge challenges there, and that we could talk about. Of course, there are different types of linguistic futures and afterlives that are possible. Even if a language is no longer a daily vernacular, it can still be used in symbolic, performative, what have been called post-vernacular ways, and we see that increasingly. And the rising costs of city life, gentrification, the lack of a linguistic infrastructure, even though there have been some attempts in cities. I'm curious about what's happening in Vancouver, but we're seeing cities in North America, some even as the national level in the US is impossible, as I'll say briefly. Cities have been experimenting in the last decade or so. And then, of course, the future of immigration, which is now seems to be a worldwide question. Will mobility be radically restricted to certain groups, and what will this mean for communities that are maybe stranded, that have already been created? What will this mean for those who have no other place to go? Just to say that in the last couple of years, just before this, the so-called migrant crisis in New York kind of had brought these issues sort of to a head, many new language communities, but at the same time, a kind of strain in terms of the way that people were trying to react, but not succeeding in kind of providing the linguistic understanding and infrastructure for this kind of the mounting challenge. And this is what's led to, this was in the presidential race in the US last year, Trump saying these things, kind of a new politics of demonizing linguistic diversity in very confused and strange ways, truly foreign languages that nobody speaks. That seems like a contradiction in terms, but, and then not one instructor in our entire nation. Well, that raises the question, maybe we should invest in language instruction. But, you know, not to close on a dark note, but just in the last couple of weeks now, there's been this kind of unprecedented executive order which has come down designating English as the official language of the United States. And this is a historic rupture in terms of language policy, or the lack thereof, in the history of the US, which has never had an official language across its nearly 250-year history. And the sort of most concrete effect is the revocation of this executive order, which had provided a modicum of language access and support at the federal level. But the sort of deeper meaning, which I've recently written about with Mark for the conversation, actually is about, you know, what this means for language politics and for linguistic diversity more widely, and a sort of chilling effect on those who will kind of stray from this kind of monolingual, mono-ethnic identity that's being projected. So what does this mean for the future of Language City, whether that be Language City of New York or Toronto or Vancouver or London or Jakarta or Johannesburg? I think remains to be seen. But I believe that there's still time, and it's still vital to appreciate, document, and support the linguistic diversity, extraordinary as it is, of today's cities. Thank you. Yeah, questions or comments, thoughts?
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. This is so interesting and such important work. I actually have quite a few questions, but I'll ask one that's related to your last point. I was actually thinking about this throughout your talk. With the current policy changes or administration changes, do you foresee any challenges in terms of your work? And are you guys preparing anything to, like, in preparation for policy changes? And I ask this because this is unprecedented in the US, but like where I grew up and the language that I work on, there is actually a official language for quite a long time.
Yeah.
And there's very specific policies in terms of that. And I'm wondering, like, are you guys discussing anything that's in relation to that, or looking at other countries' examples, like in preparation for this?
Thank you. There's so much going on right now, and the sort of different kinds of attacks and changes are happening so quickly that it's hard to know. I mean, there were at one point there were rumors that, you know, foreign language instruction as a whole might be kind of asseverated in the US, because a lot of the funding comes through the Department of Education for people to teach foreign languages. And that's, you know, a whole different, there are so many different pieces of this. And, you know, what the practical part that I mentioned, the especially practical part that is clearly beyond symbolic, that allows federal agencies potentially to disregard language at all, or not to provide kind of any interpretation or access, may be interpreted differently by different agencies. So we have to see how it all is going to play out. I think we need to learn from other places and see how these things have gone. And there's, of course, a range of kind of repressive and coercive, or at different levels, kind of ways that official languages are imposed or disseminated. Yeah, we're scrambling to really understand what we can do besides sort of continuing our work. There's federal funding. I mean, our funding as an organization is very much kind of catch as catch can, shoestring, but at times the National Science Foundation, which is one of the kind of national federal levels, has been a funding stream for language documentation and endangered language work. So the disappearance of those things and the fears of different communities as well, and the effects that are the differential effects on different communities. I think there's going to have to be, many sort of different responses, and it's going to be potentially a kind of long and difficult fight just to kind of just to maintain things. So it's a longer conversation, I guess, and I want to have a brighter view. I mean, I think there will be a fight in many ways, as there has been a fight, but increasing. Yeah, I would be interested to know in terms of the other places with the policies that you've looked at, and the cases that like what is effective. But I think it's going to have to be communities and linguists and others kind of really buckling down and working together and trying to survive this.
Oh, I hate using microphones. Thanks, Ross. I'm a bit of a data geek, with at least one of my hats is data geek, and I'm really interested in data and visualizing it. And so as I was watching you show us your mapping projects, a lot of my question was about how did you get all this data and how you made decisions about.
Yeah.
I heard you say census data.
Yeah.
But did you literally walk streets and go in, knock doors? And I'm also interested, especially in the digital mapping.
Yeah.
Do you have a time dimension as well? Is it possible to track language shifts over time, which might be really important now as well?
Unfortunately, it's not possible on the digital map tool itself, like that magical slider or something that would show a diachronic change. The core of the map, in many ways, I didn't kind of get in there and demonstrate, but I hope you'll kind of play around and take a look, is in those kind of qualitative stories that, when you click on any given dot, are there. And it's a lot of text when laid end to end. And in those, there are kind of micro stories, and we do have ways of, I mean, there are, historical stories are part of that. And we do have different ways that sites are categorized too. So there are sites for liturgical languages, there are community sites, there are residential sites, and there are historical sites, which are sites where the language was used in the past. So it's not, there's no kind of clear quantitative data-driven way to get a diachronic picture, which that just kind of reflects, I think, the technical limitations. But also, I mean, in terms of the data, that raised different questions because, we did, as part of this, I mean, we poured through census data, which, we found ultimately is only good for the top, 10% of all of these languages. We poured through all the historical sources, which you have to read against the grain because they usually don't kind of talk about the actual oral language use as we would think of it. And then the bulk of it was these thousands of conversations, which occasionally there was actual kind of pounding the pavement and like going to events and having tables and things like that. But mostly it was this kind of network snowball effect of just all of our network of kind of several hundred people ultimately, which expanded through this to kind of members of all different communities, one of whom would lead to the next person, and sort of from our knowledge of the linguistic geography and diversity of places where we knew people were coming from, we would sort of know where to, where to sort of ask. And I think the key maybe bedrock in many ways of those sites are these hometown associations, of which there are thousands and really often represent like a very kind of clear ethno-linguistic link. But the data is, and it's all, I should say, you know, freely can be downloaded. It's you know, the data is open, and the code is open source and all of that, and all of the choices we wrote about in a co-authored article with Mark and Sienna and others that's called Mapping Linguistic Diversity in New York Tools, Outcomes, and so on. So there were a legion of choices. I think it's still kind of it's on the line of also being like a storytelling map and having like significant qualitative elements. It's been interesting to see different, you know, data geeks using it and layering it, and sometimes very effectively. I mean, during that height of COVID, part of how I can say that these were the most hard-hit areas were multilingual immigrant neighborhoods is because we layered Department of Health case data onto the language map and could see very clear connections, and therefore also adjust in terms of the messages that we were, you know, PSAs and things making in different languages. But still, I think it has to be kind of understood like in sort of fine-grained, subtle, qualitative detail. And you know, it's certainly fascinating and important, and people are trying to kind of make comparisons with housing and income and all kinds of other things, but it doesn't, you know, it's not like the census for you know, all its problems around language does have a kind of reach and resources that they can actually kind of drill down in a certain way for those bigger languages, at least in ways that we can't, which is part of why we took the significant sites approach, as opposed to trying to say there are 53 speakers here or there. That, you know, that level is, there are all kinds of questions that would come out of that. So a partial answer, but we have, and I think also kind of combine the historical story. It's also about combining it with the account in Language City, of which a significant part is the kind of diachronic story. So what we've tried to put out is a kind of constellation of different resources between the book, the map, all of our kind of hundreds of videos, recordings, and other things online, which one can sort of try to triangulate between. But it's also been kind of what we can do with limited resources.
So unfortunately, we're out of time, but we have the room for a little bit longer, so we can
Great.
stay longer
I'm happy
and
to.
have a discussion. But thank you so much for the
Thank
talk.
you, guys. Thank you.
I have not read it yet, but.
Thank you. Yeah.
And because we were talking about it, I saw this on the shelf on the display, and I was like, that looks like an amazing book.